right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for promoting wildlife on your small farm. This is the first of a 6-part webinar series that we're offering. My name is Alice, and I'm with the OSU Extension Service in Washington County with the Oregon Master Naturalist Program. And tonight's webinar, we are going to have Nicole speaking for about 30 or 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A that's moderated by Andrew. And please feel free to type in any questions you have into the Q&A box here on Zoom. And then if you have any other maybe technical difficulties, go ahead and put those into the chat box. And before we get started, I'm going to pass it off to Andrew and Nicole to introduce themselves.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a warm day in Portland. So tonight's webinar, as Alice mentioned, is going to be on promoting wildlife on your small farm. We are also recording this presentation, and we will upload it onto the YouTube page for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, probably by some point early next week. And we'll send a link out to everyone who is registered for this webinar with that recording. So if there is anything that you missed and you want to go back and rewatch, that will be available for you. As well, we also have a survey that will pop up directly after this webinar finishes. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to go ahead and fill that out for us, it's a great help in helping us develop these webinar series, and it helps us, kind of do these things more often. And with that, I'm gonna go ahead and hand it off to Nicole, and we'll get started from there.
Great, thanks Andrew and Alice. Welcome everybody. I can't see you, so I know you're there. It is definitely a different approach to just be talking at my computer. So please do make use of the chat box. If you have questions, feel free to ask them as we go along. I'm actually going to start by asking you a couple of questions. And Andrew, if you wouldn't mind, I don't have the view of the chat right now because I think I'm sharing my screen, but if you don't mind, Andrew, just giving me these answers somehow throughout, interrupt me. Just have a good understanding of who's joining us tonight. If you wouldn't mind, if you're willing to share in the chat box where your farm or property is located that you're interested in adding wildlife to tonight. And then also just the size of your farm. I think that helps you to have an understanding of the audience as well. So feel free to just kind of write those in as I'm getting started here. Just to introduce myself really briefly, my name is Nicole Ruggiero. I'm the Rural Conservation Specialist for the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. And I will talk a little bit more about what that actually means. I've been there about 2 years. And my background is in wildlife biology and also private lands conservation. So kind of bringing those two things together tonight, this is one of my very favorite topics, in fact, because of that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to OSU for hosting us today. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Just to jump in, Nicole. So we have somebody out in Estacada with a 2-acre farm, another person who doesn't have a farm but is very interested in small farms, and then another person down in Southwest Portland, kind of over by Tyrone Creek with about a 1/2-acre farm in a wildlife-rich area. So great. a nice kind of across the board mix tonight.
Okay, well, feel free, folks, to keep adding those comments and bits of information into the chat. Thanks, Andrew. That helps. Sounds like a kind of a local crowd, which is great. I want to talk a little bit about the Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District first, just to give you a sense of who we are. For those of you outside of our service district, this is generally good information about soil and water conservation districts, or SWCDs in general. You all have one, probably. So this is good information to have. We've been around since 1955, and we are one of 45 SWCDs, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, in Oregon. So most counties have their very own. Some counties are split, like Multnomah County actually has an east and a west SWCD. And this is true across the country. So this is a really important sort of special quasi-government special district that serves the community. Our service area is Washington County, which I'll show you in a little bit, lines pretty well with the Tualatin watershed or the Tualatin Basin. And so we've chosen that as our name, just better describes what we do. We work with residents in our community to help implement sustainable solutions to conserve and enhance natural resources. And 4 things that we really like to kind of drive home and say about ourselves: we are non-regulatory, so we don't enforce laws. We are there to help you understand the laws and help you understand how to best manage the resources on your property. We serve everyone, so we are paid for through taxes, and we answer all phone calls and visit whoever asks for our help. We also are connectors, so when we don't have the actual answer or the resources ourselves, we help you find those that do, and then we work locally, so on the county level, as I said earlier. These 3 things below here are kind of the pillars of what we do. We offer technical assistance, so that's typically offering advice through phone calls or on-site visits to properties to talk about your resource concerns and offer advice and management advice for those things. And then, as I said earlier, connecting you to the resources that you need. We also offer financial assistance. So in order to implement the projects and practices that we might recommend, we have some programs that help with cost share and also some grant programs. The tree grant is a larger grant that typically goes towards entities like nonprofits and government agencies, and the twig grant is a small version of that, which is more focused at the private land level. And then we offer education programs just like this. Given COVID-19, we're doing more of this online, but in general or normally we would do a lot of in-person workshops, educational events, doing tabling events at community events, and producing and distributing educational materials. Some of the guiding principles of what SWCDs do, we just believe that conservation should be led by local citizens, and that the responsibility for implementing conservation really lies with the owner of land. We are responsive to landowners and operators, people that manage land, maybe that they don't own, and the community as a whole. So we're, as I said earlier, here to serve everyone. Just to give you a visual of our service area and the Tualatin Basin and Washington County. The dotted line on this map, black line there, is the Washington County boundary. And the colored areas are the Tualatin Basin. So as you can see, they line up pretty well. That isn't always the case, of course, but line up pretty well across the county and the basin. Like many counties, I think in the Willamette Valley, the land uses are split into broadly forest land. So this is private forests, small woodlands, but also federal and state forests, commercial forests. This makes up about 50% of the Tualatin Basin. Agriculture along the Tualatin floodplain, so in the lowlands there, that's the brown part on this map, that's about 35% of the basin. And then the rest, about 15%, is what's considered urban. So mostly the western suburbs of Portland, like Beaverton and Tigard, and then also the other small towns, Cornelius, Forest Grove, and so on. So it gives you kind of a sense of what we do or where we work. There are different natural resource concerns for each of these different land uses, but all of these areas have an impact on the watershed and all our land uses that we can help advise. And then this is kind of another visual, an illustration of some of the land uses in the basin and how it's sort of set up. The Tualatin River watershed is bordered by the Coast Range in the west, the Tualatin Mountains in the north and east, and then the Chehalem Mountains to the south. The Tualatin River is the only river in the watershed, and it drains over 900 miles of tributaries and streams. In Washington County, we receive about 40 inches annually of rain, and so that's typical of the Willamette Valley in general. And a lot of that, has impact on our waterways. And then, of course, the Tualatin flows down to meet the Willamette and eventually down to the Columbia. So that just gives you a sense of the watershed. Okay, kind of jumping into what we're here to talk about tonight, farms and wildlife. As you probably already know, farms are extremely important for sustaining wildlife. And one of the messages I really want to drive home tonight is that even small patches of habitat can be enough and can be helpful for wildlife that are moving through the landscape, finding shelter from predators, water, food, and then even staying a while and nesting and breeding on your property. So really there's a lot we can do as farm managers or farm owners. And this habitat can also benefit farmers. There's sort of a mutual benefit in the fact that these areas are important for providing water quality benefits, pollination, and also natural pest controls. Just want to back up for a minute and talk a little bit about the history of the Willamette Valley in terms of habitat loss. Habitat loss generally is the process of natural habitat becoming incapable of supporting native wildlife. And this graphic here comes from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Conservation Strategy. It's just a way of showing that over the last 100 or so years, habitat has really changed, and the land use in the Willamette Valley has changed quite considerably. The yellow and brown and green represent what was more native conditions of oak and prairie habitat, vast floodplain, other types of woodland, things like that. And most of this, of course, is cultivated now and populated and urbanized. So, we've changed this area quite a bit. This statistic here, 14% of the United States is considered to be protected land. And that's in quotes because that includes all sorts of types of working lands as well. Things like national forests, not necessarily lands that have completely been set aside for nothing other than wildlife habitat, but it's a small percentage nonetheless. So just wanted to kind of give you a sense of what we're talking about here. And some of the reasons for the loss of wildlife habitat is fairly obvious. Human population has grown, we've colonized and really moved into these areas and made it more hospitable for housing and urbanization and our uses. And agricultural land in particular has been very easy to convert to those uses. And then also the conversion of land to intensive agricultural uses is another impact on wildlife habitat. In addition, we've lost farmland in Oregon in recent decades as well. Oregon has a very strong land use planning system that you might be aware of. And this has really helped slow the conversion of agriculture to other uses over time. But even so, even with those land use planning laws in place, the average age of farmers right now is over 60 years old. And what that means is that in the next 20 years, most of these farms will change hands to the next generation or who knows. So the uses of those lands, as you know, from farmland to what's next is really just an unknown variable and just a threat essentially to farmland and also to having these open spaces for wildlife species. This statistic here, 2001 to 2016, and this year, this time span, this is a statistic from a recent American Farmland Trust report. And this points out that 65,800 acres of Oregon agriculture land was converted to developed land during that time. So even with our strong land use planning system, we still lose farmland to development even now. Just a couple other sort of background things that I want to point out. It's really important, I think, to talk about stewarding land and our role as land managers and land to the welfare of society in more ways than society usually acknowledges or even knows. These farmers produce valuable goods, of course, but they also conserve soil, they conserve water, they conserve wildlife, they conserve open space, and they conserve scenery. So again, there's a real responsibility as landowners or farmers to provide these benefits for all of society. And it's not always acknowledged, but farmers are the first conservationists, as someone said, maybe one of these guys actually. So just something to keep in mind as we talk through some of this.
Hey, Nicole, can I jump in real quick?
Yes.
We had a question come in from the Q&A asking if forested areas are considered to be agricultural lands.
That's a good question. They are not in terms of the statistics I showed you earlier, or that kind of general breakdown of the upper slopes of the county being forest, the lower being 35% agriculture. We've really split that in that way. Certainly there are forested lands in those 35% as well. But I'm speaking more about cultivated land, not necessarily as forest land, but I think a lot of this really applies to. I would say that there's a lot of crossover there. If you have a small land and you're managing timber, for harvest, you're farming trees in a sense. So hopefully that answers that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Just to talk locally a little bit about Washington County a bit more. We have over 100,000 acres of farmland. So that's that 35% again. But the point here is that most of these farms are under 50 acres. And I'd say the same for Clackamas County and the Portland area. We're talking typically about lots and lots of small farms. And the recent USDA farm census showed that that's on the rise. There's more and more of these small farms that are making up our farmed acres. And so together, these farms can support and maintain wildlife. And just the point being that small farms matter. We each have to do our part to sustain and support wildlife on our properties. And I think farms are increasingly recognized for their importance in land stewardship and conservation. So none of this is necessarily groundbreaking, but just want to make sure that that's well understood. The right management of agriculture and of the landscape as a whole can really be a mutual benefit between farmers and the wildlife that they benefit. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Just getting in a little bit to some of the wildlife we're talking about tonight. I think Washington County is pretty similar to other parts of the Willamette Valley. There's a broad suite of species that we can benefit on our farms, things like pollinators, lots of bird species, and other wildlife. And really it's going to depend what your farm can sustain and what you're interested in having there. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go. There are some rare species and that are especially important to consider. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that as we go too. Okay, how can you promote wildlife on your farm? I think that the main takeaway here is that habitat really, creating and enhancing habitat is the name of the game. So it's not about importing wildlife to your farm necessarily, but more about the approach of if you build it, they will come. And some of the concepts here, these are really the important points, the important components: having food, having sources of water, having places that wildlife feel covered and safe, and then just generally space, having areas where they can move between farms, between properties, and across the landscape. And these concepts can be overlapping, and often, any technique to promote wildlife might cover multiple of these concepts, but these are really the big ones that we're going to try and hit on. It's important to keep in mind that all species of wildlife have specific requirements. So what may be good for one might not be good for another, unless there's, a really good reason. I wouldn't worry too much about that. You're not really working hard to get one specific animal on the property necessarily, but just focusing on an overall healthy ecosystem, you'll likely benefit multiple species. And I think that's, you know, a good goal to have on your property. Okay, well, let's talk through the steps of this. Promoting wildlife really is, you know, just taking good notes at first, really working to identify what's currently found on your property. This might take a while. You know, I keep a list just on my small property here in the suburbs of just what birds we see every year. You know, you may need to get to know it if it's new to you, especially just to really understand who's already here, who's using this. And then identifying your goals. I think I mentioned a little bit about this already, but you know, maybe there are specific species you want or don't want, and that's okay too. I mean, for example, if you're a small vegetable grower, you may not want deer on your property, and that list goes on and on. So, you know, if you're, you know, that's something to consider. It's really about your goals, which is okay. And then also to inventory your resources. So resources meaning habitat components. What's there? What do you have in terms of food and cover and water? And then using that information, you can then start to add the components that you want and that promote the wildlife you want. This sheet here, hopefully you can see that well enough on your computers, and we can provide this. Just get in touch with us after. This is a great worksheet that comes from OSU Extension through their land steward course. It's really just a worksheet so that you can answer the questions I just talked through about what kind of habitat you have, you know, really going through the property. Do we have mixed conifer forests? Do we have oak woodlands? And, you know, just inventorying that so that you have a place to refer to that. If you do have forest, how many layers of vegetation does it have? What kind of condition is it in? You know, is it just a single canopy, or does it have a shrub layer and a healthy understory and a healthy tree layer? Those kinds of things. Do you have nesting opportunities for birds and other species on the property? What kind of access to water do you have? Is there a stream? Do you have a wetland? Do you have a puddle that, you know, holds water longer in the year? Those things can be more important than you might realize. And then the actual wildlife species, as I said earlier, you know, that might take a while. It might take people that know more than you do, but just to spend some time recording what you're hearing and seeing, what you're seeing signs of. That's just a good way to start, to have a good baseline and good inventory of what you have. When it comes to starting to implement some of these projects and practices, I would say native plants are really the easiest thing one can do to encourage wildlife, improve conditions for wildlife on your property. Hedgerows are great for this. This is not only for providing food and cover, but also we talked a little bit about space early on there as one of the components. So having these corridors and linkages between habitats. Hedgerows are great for that. These can also create nesting opportunities for birds in particular, and then some pollinator benefits. I think I say a little more about that on the next slide. But anyway, you know, there's a variety of widths that are okay. I'd say 30 feet is great in terms of a width that you could go for. And then the other thing to consider about planting natives in a hedgerow would be to vary the heights and bloom times of the species that you choose. So in general, a continuous bloom throughout the summer. You don't want to just have all things that bloom in May, for example. The things throughout the summer that bloom is great. Native plants are also great. I just mentioned pollinators, birds, small mammals in terms of food. So a lot of these are berry producing, so that's really wonderful. And then of course, if they're berry producing, they have flowers, so that's great for the pollinators. And then also planting these native plants along any streams as well. It's great for help with erosion and shade, and just considering these in place of some of the non-natives like blackberry that might be taking over areas. These are great competitors and really just well adapted and suited for our climate. So they're really easy to grow once you get them established. Access to water, it sounds kind of obvious. Everything needs water, and just just a little puddle will do, but it is important. And I encourage you to take note of this on your property. Are there areas where their water kind of persists throughout the summer? And if you have it, I bet you're finding things in it. You know, bird baths are great on a small scale. Obviously, you know, if you're managing a larger property, you can't manage bird baths everywhere, but you know, just really taking note and appreciation of any natural occurring streams or wetlands as well. These are really important for wildlife, especially in, you know, this time of year. Rotating crops and planting cover crops are a great thing to do. This just encourages biodiversity on the property. Cover crops can also provide some natural pest management and support pollinators if you're choosing species that are blooming. If you have pest concerns in a certain field, for example, leaving it fallow for a year or two and having it covered in something that's blooming and adding, you know, other benefits to the soil is just a great thing for pollinators and wildlife species as well. Reducing tillage and mowing. There are certain crops or certain areas of your property that might be well suited to this. This is also great for soil health. The residue that is left there, if you're, you know, doing less tillage and after a mow, can provide great habitat for a lot of different species. And then also grasses are just great for nesting habitat for certain birds. We encourage people to, if you're going to mow areas that are grassy, to mow after July 15th, and that's the best sort of a safe date for grassland birds that are nesting. They're typically all moved out by then. So just letting some areas go fallow and leaving that, you know, residue or vegetation is just another easy thing to do if there's a spot that's suited for that. Creating shelter is another great thing. Obviously, there are some really manipulated approaches to this in the terms of bird and bat houses or bee boxes, those kinds of things. Those are all great to add, but also there's some natural things you can do to create shelter. And it's funny, this photo in the bottom corner here, this is a brush pile. And we have specifications to tell you how to make the best brush pile, but you could just leave a brush pile and not even follow that and probably be doing a really good job for all sorts of things. Same with a rock pile. You may have one that you didn't even realize you were already doing a great thing for wildlife species. I have a rock pile that often has a snake or two sitting on it on a sunny day, and you know, these are great for natural pest control and just great to leave around, to have these things as habitat features. So if it's a project you've been meaning to get to, you can now tell yourself it's actually a intentional habitat feature, and that's an okay thing to do, a great thing to do. But for all of these things, we do have specifications and designs if you're curious about the right way to create a birdhouse, for example. More in creating shelter. If you're trying to encourage raptors on the property, you know, maybe for vole eradication, that sort of thing, having some perches around for them, some poles to perch on is a great thing. And that's also something we can provide a specification for if you're interested in that. Also, you know, snags, logs that are down. I think sometimes there's this feeling, and if you're busy enough, maybe not, but you know, this need to clean things up a little bit and get these standing dead trees out of there, or get these logs off the forest floor or off the edge. But honestly, these are just really great habitat features for a lot of different species. There are many cavity nesting birds that actually won't use a bird box. So you could provide all the boxes you want, but they really want their own hole to, you know, to create their own cavity. So leaving some snags and dead standing trees is really important. And if they're not creating a hazard, if they're not threatening a structure or, you know, some other infrastructure on your property, it's great to just leave those in place, or even create them in places where it makes sense to do so. I talked a little bit about this in terms of hedgerows, but just thinking about travel corridors. So again, go back to your goals. what kind of wildlife am I trying to encourage? What kind of travel corridor needs do they have? You know, if these are large animals, you might need large areas. But any way of just connecting areas of non-habitat with vegetation, native vegetation cover is great. And I think, you know, there's just a number of species that will make use of that. Connecting habitat along creeks and streams is a really obvious and easy place to do that. Adding hedgerows in places where they, you know, there is not a natural break like that is also great. And then if you need to fence the property for whatever reason, considering wildlife friendly fences, again, going back to, you know, depending on what you're growing, who you want to be there, maybe this isn't necessarily ideal, but if you're okay with, you know, coyotes and deer moving through, thinking about smooth wires on the top and on the bottom of those fences so things can get under or go over safely, that sort of thing. And then I think this really just goes back to a lot of the things I just talked to. Just really thinking about areas of the farm that are unmanaged. And I say this a lot, and I've actually today heard one of my clients repeat it back to me, which was very gratifying to hear. Yep, nature is messy. And you know, I think when we have pride of ownership, we want to make sure things look tidy and there's no weedy areas, and you know, we just, you know, there's a desire sometimes, I think, as, you know, whatever we are culturally, to just have full control of things. But nature's messy, and there's areas that need to be, you know, that can be just left a little unmanaged. And this doesn't mean letting weeds go wild and you know, causing your neighbors to hate you, but really to just allow nature to do its thing, allow native plants to do their thing, in particular, creating some breaks and buffers between the areas that you are heavily managing and the areas that you're not. And it just really provides great habitat. I think the brush pile, it might be my favorite example of this, because it looks like this thing you haven't gotten to sometimes, but really, you know, intentionally, it can be a great source of cover and habitat for a variety of species. So this is kind of my take home message tonight, is just, yeah, nature's messy, I guess. I think with that, I'm through the meat of this and ready to take some questions. Let me see if there's a way for me to see them rather than you telling them to me, Andrew.
Yeah, no worries.
Back out of this, yeah. Let me see, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. No. How do I stop?
So yeah, it should just be a little button on that bottom bar there. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to go ahead and put them into that Q&A box. And Nicole is more than happy to answer some of them. While you all are writing in, I will give a plug out for the rest of our webinars that we'll be offering in this series. As Alice mentioned at the top, we're going to be having, this is actually a 6-part webinar series that we'll be doing through August. Our next one will be in 2 weeks. It'll be about combating climate change on your farm. And then we have several other webinars in August that will be touching base on some of the different trees that you'll find on your property, how wildfire might impact, how you can prepare your property for wildfire, as well as how you might be able to deal with some nuisance wildlife species that you might find on occasion. So any questions out there?
I do see one here. Mentioned not tilling is good for soil. Understand, is not mowing good for soil? That's a good question. Can't really see why it would be, honestly. You know, if you're mowing, you're working on what's on top. As long as you're leaving, you know, that stubble, that actually encourages root growth. So, no, honestly, you know, depends on your goals. If you're, you know, mowing to just reduce fire danger, mowing to increase use maybe for pasture and just, you know, managing your grass in that way. Oh, I think that mowing doesn't really affect soil health, but that's my hunch. I'm not sure I'm an expert on that. Hopefully that answered.
Any other questions out there? We have a quiet crowd tonight, Nicole.
That's okay.
That's okay too. Oh, just as I speak, I must have needed to say something. So it looks like we got 2 more that popped into the queue.
Okay, I'm not doing yet. Is it better to make preserved snags or put up bird or bat boxes? Also a good question. Well, I would say both, honestly. Again, it goes back to who do you want to be there? There are cavity nesting birds that are what we call secondary cavity nesters, so they can't actually make their own nest or their own hole. And so they depend on either another woodpecker or cavity nester's previously used hole. So, you know, that's a little bit of a limited resource. So for those kind of species, providing a nest box is actually really important because they won't use a snag. And that includes the white-breasted nuthatch, which is a fairly, you know, it's a species of concern in the Willamette Valley. I'd like to say it's rare. I see them a lot. They're oak associated though, and they really need a nest box or a, you know, a used cavity. So for those guys, it's better to put up a box. Lots of other woodpeckers, the primary cavity nesters, those that make their own, will not use a nest box. So they're going to want a snag. So if possible, I'd say do both. And then the other I'm seeing here, should we use bird feeders or even during the summer? I just was asked this question by my sister. I don't see a reason not to. I would like to reserve the right to not be an expert on this. I really don't see a reason not to. Birds are feeding young in the summer. They need to eat either way. I don't think you're ruining any of them by offering, you know, food year round. I feed all summer long. So certainly it's harder to find food in the winter and your bird feeders are extra important during that time. But yeah, I will defer to further bird feeding experts on that one, but my hunch is it's fine to do so. What resources are there for combating invasive species? We actually have a whole invasives crew at our district, and so you know, feel free to reach back out. I've just got my email up there, and our website is there too. You can look us up there. But within your own conservation district too, for those of you that are outside the county, there should be some good help there for talking through specifically which species you're talking about. Do honeybees compete with native and mason bees and cause stress? I don't know the answer to this.
I can hop in with that one.
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
So typically honeybees and native bees aren't gonna outcompete one another. Honeybees are most popular because they're easy to transport, and they go to they last longer throughout the season. Whereas typical mason bees or typical native bee species like mason bees, leafcutter bees, they have shorter seasons, but they're better pollinators, if that makes sense. They get more pollen on them, they stay longer on the plant, so you have a more opportunity for that pollination to occur. So they're not going to outcompete. It's just going to be you know, typically they're going to be better pollinators, but shorter pollinators.
That's great. I'm glad I'm learning something while I'm here too.
And if anyone is interested more in some of our native bee, to learn more about some of our native bees in Washington County, on the same YouTube page that will have the link to this webinar, we actually currently have several webinars by Bee in Bloom that we did earlier this spring that go into more detail about leafcutter bees, mason bees, and then some other bee species that you might be able to see. And I apologize for my shaky camera. I have a couple of pups who are trying to play underneath me at the moment.
Oh, is it worth my time to grow oak on my property? I'm battling invasive species and they grow slowly. They do grow slowly, but yes, it is worth it, your time, I would say. If you have an area, especially where you can, I don't know, it sounds like you'll be babying them along if you're constantly battling invasive species. I mean, I think anytime you're trying to establish natives, the best thing is to work really hard on the front end, getting rid of your invasives. And that can be a lot of work, and it's less gratifying than growing the actual plants you want there. But I do think it ends up for a more long-term success. But oak are disappearing across the landscape. They're extremely important for wildlife, and so any place that you think is well suited for them and have the opportunity to try and grow them, I would say it's worth your time. And other than oaks, what are other desirable species currently? When it comes to tree species, that would be my first thought. You know, for the Willamette Valley in particular is a really just desirable species to grow. But in terms of shrubs, boy, it's a really long list. And wondering if there's a better way to give you some ideas. But it'll depend on how wet your area is. We've got some of our native shrubs that are better suited for drier conditions. As I mentioned earlier on, it's great to try and establish something that will bloom, you know, a variety of species that will bloom throughout the season. So kind of build a list that includes some early bloomers, some late bloomers, mid bloomers, some late bloomers. Yeah, if you get in touch directly, we could help with providing. There's some really good resources out there, just like a list of great native species that you should try and look for at your native nurseries or plant sales.
And Nicole, if you have that resource and wanted to send along to me, I'm more than happy to include that in that email that I send out to everyone with the webinar recording.
Yeah, we've got some good resources for that.
Yeah, we can absolutely include those.
Will do. Good ideas to attract owls. That is a good question. Well, again, I think nesting opportunities are a really good thing. It depends on the owl, but barn owls are going to do best if you provide a nest box. And there's some great there's great plans out there, but even some pre-made barn owl boxes. So that's an owl that really just depends on those. I don't know what they did historically before people were around, but and before barns were around. Great horned owls. They build a platform nest. So if you have a forested area with some broken top trees, for example, that's a great thing for them. I'm trying to think of other things to do for attracting them. Yeah, I think screech owls also will use special screech owl boxes. I've tried that on my own property with no luck, however. So it's tough. It's hard to know. If you're growing chickens, that's a great way to attract owls. Probably not the answer that people who are farming chickens want. Yeah. Hopefully this helps a little. Well, my contact information is here. I'm happy to answer questions over email or over the phone. So if your question isn't coming to you right now, do feel free to get in touch directly. We have a small group, so I think that's manageable. And that's what we're here for. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll also CC Nicole on that email that I send out to everyone, so you will have her contact information directly in your inbox. Well,
great.
thank you all again for tuning in this evening. I hope you were able to start thinking about some ideas on how you might be able to promote wildlife on your farm. And as Nicole mentioned, please don't be a stranger. If there's anything that we can help with, whether you're within our district or outside of our district, that's what we're here for. We can connect you to some resources that we have locally, or we can help you find where your local SWCD might be. Great. Well, thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.